So our final yoga tool is self-care off the mat, though I am cheating a little bit because some of what I'll talk about here could be on the mat as well. This is a shorter version of a presentation I've done a couple times, so there's a little bit of extra bonus material in here as well. So why take care of ourselves? All of the many reasons, and in part that is because we live in this larger culture that we can consider to be a toxic culture, literally a toxic environment. The work that we do also, when we're serving others, we need to also be taking care of ourselves, mostly repeating things you already know. But we again might think about this toxic environment that we live in, the physical world of pollution and chemicals and toxins, the overprocessed foods, the too much information, too much screen time, many different forms of physical and emotional trauma, COVID, for instance. And then also this culture where we value individualism over community, where we have all of these different isms that impact people every day, these ideas about pain, no gain, over rest or relaxation, and productivity over pleasure. So we need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. And we know that what happens in our bodies impacts our minds, and what we experience in our minds impacts our bodies. So that's part of what we're thinking about in terms of self-care. And as we talk about in the world of trauma, our issues are in our tissues. So we've got those physical and mental kinds of connections that we can use yoga as a tool and remedy for. From our Science of Yoga book, enhancing your mind-body and your body-mind connection increases your ability to self-regulate and improves your resilience. So that's one of the benefits of yoga toward self-care. So how do we take care of ourselves? How do we care for our minds and our bodies, and why must we? And this brings me to this very famous quote from Audre Lorde: "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." So what does it mean to take care of ourselves, and what are those kind of larger ripples out into our world from that self-care? Self-care has become this very kind of trendy idea in popular culture. And we want to make sure that we're remembering that self-care is much more than mimosas and pedicures. Maybe mimosas and pedicures play into self-care, and that's okay, no judgment there. But it's more than just this kind of buzzword and contemporary trend, and it's more than just like treating ourselves to things. So self-care is not a luxury. It's especially important for caregivers, for empaths, for the systematically oppressed. It is a counterbalance to service and a form of self-compassion and self-love, and it counters dominant norms and expectations, some of which I've mentioned here. I love this little meme here about self-care ideas, because these can be very, very simple things that we do to take care of ourselves. They might be just a little thing each day. It might be something that we have a regular practice of, or something that we recognize that we need a little bit of self-care intervention, and maybe put a finger on the square and do that thing. But again, a lot of just little things that we can do for ourselves to take care of ourselves, or bigger things as well. From the reading that we have in this last module, thinking a little bit about also the idea of radical care and what that means. So again, self-care and taking care of ourselves, but then also radical care in terms of communities. So Angela Davis, a author, critic, academic, activist, explicitly ties social change to care. I think our notions of what counts as radical have changed over time. So radical, getting to the roots of something, self-care and healing and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension, all of this is now a part of radical social justice struggles. That wasn't the case before. So looking at radical care as a set of vital but underappreciated strategies for enduring the precarious world or worlds that we live in. And in the face of state-sanctioned violence, economic crisis, impending ecological collapse, all of those big, huge things, we need collective care as a way forward, because self-care is not going to do much about those larger structures. It's going to help us take care of ourselves in the meantime. But what does that look like to actually maybe change some of those larger structures? And then also we might think about this concept of radical self-care. Really great book here by Bo Forbes, Yoga for Emotional Balance, and I've got a couple ideas in this PowerPoint in a moment. But self-care is not always about doing an activity with the intention of caring for ourselves, but can also be about doing less. It's also about the ongoing dialogue that we have with dominant culture's expectations for us to drive and produce. So thinking again about these expectations, like almost literally killing ourselves for our families or for the work that we do, and obviously being not a good way of caring for ourselves. So maybe doing something to care for ourselves, maybe doing just less in our day, and then also that kind of pushback against those larger cultural dialogues. So in thinking about self-care and, for instance, restorative yoga, the impact of ease. So again, self-care off the mat, but some of that self-care might be on the mat. So Bo Forbes asks us to, what do support and sustenance mean to you? So maybe just pausing with that question for a moment. What do support and sustenance mean to you? How would it feel to allow someone or something to support you? What would it be like if you consistently nurtured yourself? Right? So sometimes we need to look to ourselves for that nurturing, for that support, for that sustenance that might not be coming from other sources. In restorative yoga, that practice that we haven't done a lot in this class, but restorative yoga is about a lot of props and again, literally supporting our bodies into certain poses so that we can relax and breathe there, release. So restorative yoga asks that you commit to that lost art of self-care. Comfort and self-care are essential to truly support your emotional well-being. Add the support your body asks for. Literally or figuratively, add that support that your body asks for. So again, that mind-body connection. And as we look at that mind-body connection, so a few ideas, again, in part coming from the Bo Forbes book that I just mentioned. So I want to make that connection to mental health a little bit here as well. And if we think a little bit about anxiety and depression and how those live in our minds and our bodies, we can think about, again, self-care practices and yoga as that kind of intervention. Now, this quote here is, again, pretty famous, floating around on the internet and other places, but it's obviously not so simple. But it's an interesting idea to think about that if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. And if you're at peace, you're living in the present. So just that being in the now that yoga brings us, or meditation brings us, that breathing brings us, whatever those tools that are that we're using, that being in the present as being one way to help ourselves be at peace. Again, not so simple, but I think an interesting idea. We also want to think a little bit about anxiety and depression, which can have overlapping symptoms, but it can also be very different, but then also being on a spectrum. So again, symptoms of anxiety and depression can overlap. We can range from kind of low anxiety to higher anxiety, or lower depression to higher depression. But it's also possible to, for instance, be anxious in the body and anxious in the mind, depressed in the body and depressed in the mind. But it's also possible to be anxious in the body, but depressed in the mind, and depressed in the body, but anxious in the mind. So Bo Forbes' book is a really nice book that it goes through, again, kind of how to deal with anxiety in the body or the mind, and vice versa, or how to deal with this kind of mix of anxiety and depression, and to use restorative yoga toward, again, managing or remedying those things. There are no miracle cures. I think we already know this. And a lot of times there's these long-standing patterns in the mind, the body, the brain, that require pretty diligent self-care practices to create lasting change. Anxiety and depression are patterns of thought and habits of the body that have been deeply ingrained over time. So, for instance, if we think about how repetitive movements cause injury, we can also think about how, for instance, poor posture accumulates, and some of you have noticed this. So that looking down at the phone always, we're starting to see people developing bone spurs, or also this kind of curvature and this growth out in the upper back area here. We can see how that rounding of the shoulders, right? That posture can impact our mood, as this picture here illustrates. We might find that when we're feeling down, we might literally be looking down. And so part of this is just kind of that act of noticing that if we're feeling down, we're looking down, maybe look up, see how that might be just kind of an instant little, not a fix, not a miracle cure, but an intervention in that condition. So again, physical patterns impact mental conditions. Likewise, With anxiety, we have maybe like these repeating toxic scripts that go through our heads. We're mentally beating ourselves up with negative self-talk, or we're wedded to certain narratives, certain stories about ourselves, about who we are, about what we desire. Again, especially when we've got these expectations that come from mainstream status quo kinds of expectations, what a good mother is, what a good student is, what a good citizen is, whatever those might be. So we can get really anxious and have those things spinning around. And I love this illustration here because it's like, I feel anxious. Why am I so anxious? I feel anxious about being anxious. Now I'm feeling even more anxious, and we can spin, right? In yoga, we often talk about like the monkey mind, right? That spinning mind. And so yoga, breathing, meditation, all of these things help to slow that spinning mind. And again, that anxiousness of the mind can also impact the body, right? That relationship between the mind and the body, an increased heart rate, sweating, whatever those physical conditions might be. So again, those mental patterns impact our physical conditions. And so just slowing the mind down, focusing on the breath can really help to deal with anxiety. And again, here, we're feeling anxious, maybe we fold forward, as we'll look at in another slide here. So again, part of this with self-care is the power of noticing, again, being a witness but not a judge, or an observer but not a critic. And for instance, once we bring our attention to our breath or our posture, we're already changing it. You might have noticed that as I was talking about posture, maybe you started to sit up a little bit taller, for instance. I've also mentioned interoception here, so that kind of internal body awareness. So the power of noticing what our bodies need and responding to that, noticing what our bodies and minds need and responding to that. Bo Forbes mentions the more awareness you build in your mind and body, and the more you inhabit your body, the better you'll be able to discern and honor what works best for you. And that's a really, really key part of self-care. Bo Forbes also offers this really nice little activity. Other people have done different versions of this, and I've adapted a little bit from the version that I've done with Bo Forbes. And it's this idea of the 5-minute check-in. Again, this kind of like noticing on steroids, for instance. Not really, but so this 5-minute check-in. And so this is a really nice way to get a baseline, and maybe also to bring us into the now. So we can do this check-in like first thing in the morning, middle day, end of day, beginning of yoga practice, middle of yoga practice, end of yoga practice. However, this 5-minute check-in serves you. So as we do that, we just start to notice. We might start to notice our breathing. We might start to notice what the rate of our breathing is, the speed of our mind, what is our energy level? Am I in the moment? Am I in my body? And so these are just some questions that you can ask yourself. And again, just remembering to simply observe and not to judge or criticize. But once you do this check-in, you might, again, start to realize that you're already starting to change the way that you feel just by noticing these things. And again, doing that check-in when needed and finding kind of where you are for baseline. Because once we know where we are with baseline, then we can see a little bit better when we might tend up toward anxiety or down toward depression, and maybe have some tools to bring us back to center. So all throughout our course, we've been talking about yoga, the power of yoga, the different practices of yoga, how we can use yoga for self-care, and how we can use yoga when working with patients or working with other people, friends, family, community members, whoever we might be working with. And it's not really so much yoga and what kind of yoga we're practicing, though that's important, as we've talked about, but the how of practicing yoga is the most important part. So finding that mindful movement, paying attention, coordinating our breath and movement, that one breath per movement, for instance, or as many breaths as we need to cycle through a particular pose or posture. Again, being in the now, being in the present moment, listening to our bodies, not trying to push our bodies into places that they're not ready to go. Yoga Fit, which is what I'm trained in, has these nice kind of little mantras that we use, like letting go of competition, that's competition with ourselves or others, letting go of expectations and just finding what we find, letting go of judgment, again, of ourselves or others, and being able to just really settle into stillness, into comfort and ease. A lot of people tell me that, they don't want to do yoga because it's too slow, it's boring, or whatever that is. And I think a lot of times, that tendency to not want to slow down is sometimes a discomfort with ourselves, right? Not wanting to be alone with ourselves in that kind of way, which again, It's not necessarily to judge that, that's where the person is. But if we can help people to kind of settle into that idea of being with ourselves, of being still, of being with our breath, of finding comfort, of finding ease, of supporting ourselves through these different self-care practices, then who knows what results we might find. I probably should have changed the order of my slides a little bit here. But so as I was mentioning, with anxiety and depression, with anxiety, generally forward folding is going to help us be less anxious. It's going to slow the heart rate and calm the brain. And these are just two illustrations of a restorative yoga pose. You can see just all the blankets and the pillows and that idea of supporting ourselves in this pose. And again, generally, with depression, chest opening generally helps to treat depression. So it can help to lift the mood and reduce depression, as I just said. And here we see an example of supported fish pose, which we did in our third real-time Zoom practice. And these are with bolsters rather than with blocks or blankets. And again, a couple of illustrations. We can see the one on the right here, a much more dramatic chest opening. And this one being still perhaps a little bit dramatic. We can see the curve in her back, but a little bit less with the head coming back and down. So again, however you support yourself in these poses. A really nice one that we haven't done in our practice, we've done the simple inversion of just being on our backs and bringing our legs up into the air, but we can also do that against a wall. So you're almost like literally sitting against the wall. A lot of different physical and mental benefits to the legs up the wall pose. And again, here on the right, you can see it just without props, just legs up the wall. And here, more of a restorative yoga version of that, where we've got different supports for that pose. So as we think about self-care and we think about maybe changing our habits toward more positive kinds of habits, it's important to remember that change is always possible. We can get stuck into ruts, mind or mind-body ruts. And that changing those patterns of physical movement, changing our thought patterns, changing our emotional patterns is one way that we can start to make interventions in our lives, in our minds, in our bodies. Change is pretty much always going to be incremental, sometimes not even noticeable. So as we do these different kinds of practices, we might one day just realize like, wow, I totally get this thing now, right? It takes practice, it takes commitment. And practice is always, again, toward progress. There's no end goal. We're never looking for perfection. It's really the process itself that's the goal. And just one final note here. Jamie Marich has this book, Process Not Perfection, Expressive Arts Solutions for Trauma Recovery. It's also just a really nice book with some different kind of self-care practices, some different ways of engaging in movement or different kinds of arts. Which can be, again, nice self-care practices as well. And this is not the best picture and it's kind of blurry, but I love the message here. Learning to nourish your expressive soul in small pockets during the pauses you give yourself throughout the day could be your deepest path to transformation. I didn't read that very well, so maybe read it for yourself. But again, that idea of process, not perfection. And again, not necessarily progress, but just that process and being present with ourselves and being kind to ourselves. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to think about with self-care practices. Again, off the mat, some of them are still on the mat, but things that we can take with us.